This is my GTX 1070 Ti, and well, recently with all these new games coming out, it just can't keep up. So I decided maybe I need an upgrade. Well, after some careful consideration, I decided this was necessary. With a 192-bit memory bus and 12 gigs of VRAM, it was sure to be enough for my blind eyes. Plus, it says you can do ray tracing, has dlss, and other fancy stuff they print on the box. Which, if you read the bottom left here, it's kind of the same thing repeated, so it must be good. About the same time as me getting this card, the new Myth Wukong came out with a benchmarking tool. So I decided I better crank everything to max and turn up the ray tracing to see if I can run Monkey Game very good. So starting off here, you can see Monkey Game not run very good. But that's why we have dlss, right? So I hurried over to my graphics settings, tossed on dlss in the overlay to show frame latency, and decided it's time to start it back up. So right off the start here with this one, we've nearly doubled the frame rate and now have a very playable game. The latency in the top left corner you can see is there a little bit, but completely fine for a story mode game, and I would definitely be playing with dlss on. It still looks very amazing, yeah, with ray tracing on, but I'm blind as hell and I really don't need all the ray tracing, so even though the frames stayed very consistent through the entire benchmark, I decided my blind eyes should turn off all the ray tracing and get some more frames. So I'll let this benchmark play through for those who want to see it, and anyone else can skip ahead a few seconds where I turn the ray tracing down a little bit. So for this run, I kind of forgot to show the graphics settings at the beginning, but I just turned ray tracing to medium. It's the only thing that has changed, and I will still show the graphics settings at the end on the result page. And yeah, I really can't tell the difference because I'm blind as can be, and we've gained an extra 20 frames, with latency still about the same thing and frame rate still staying consistent. I think this would be my playing setting. But I feel like we could get more out of this game. There's always something to get more. I don't need the ray tracing at all, probably. So I decided, well, I better turn that off and see what it gives me. I'll once again let this benchmark play through, and anyone who wants to go ahead to the next part, I'll mark it in the video, and if you want to watch this, enjoy. So you can see the ray tracing was just changed to medium here on the right. All the other settings are the same, but we're at 80 average FPS versus the 60 now. So just one setting change on ray tracing seemed to do well. So for this one, I just went ahead and turned ray tracing off. I left dlss on, and all other settings are still the same. So right off the start here, we get between a 7 to 10 FPS increase on most scenes. And frame latency still stays within 12 to 20 range, so very playable. I really can't tell a difference with the ray tracing on versus the ray tracing off. I may be really blind. I've went back and forth in the video multiple times. Maybe y'all can and see a difference because y'all have better eyes, but I would most likely be playing with the ray tracing off because this is an incredibly beautiful game still, and I really can't tell a difference. The one place you may be able to tell a difference is in these coming water scenes. There's a lot of open reflections through the water, but honestly, I kind of like the look with no ray tracing better than the ray tracing look. But I decided, I needed more frames. So I decided, why not hop on over to MSI Afterburner, crank up some sliders. So I'll let this benchmark play through again for those who want to watch it, and I'll mark the next part in the video where I overclock the card a little bit to see what else we can get out of it. And here you can see we got about an 8 FPS increase on the average, with the only thing being changed is the ray tracing. Here's the previous run. Let's move on to MSI Afterburner, shall we? So I went ahead and I turned off the automatic tuning settings in NVIDIA's Performance tab and went over to MSI Afterburner to crank some sliders. Over in MSI Afterburner, I didn't touch the core clock and took the memory clock to about a third of the way up, a little over, maybe 40%, and hit apply because most of the times I was seeing stuff max out, it was just memory alone. The core wasn't pulling like the memory was. Going back over to Myth Wukong, I didn't touch any of the graphic settings, still the same settings, displays still the same, and we'll see what kind of increase we get. So right off the start here, we get about a 2 to 3 FPS increase, with the average giving us a 3 FPS increase. Latency stays about the same, and you can see we've gained about a degree, sometimes 2 degrees on the temp. Fans are still spinning the same, and we're still using the same amount of VRAM. So we are drawing about 2 more watts, but the 4070 is hard limited at 200, so we really can't go over that, so power draw is really not anything to worry about when overclocking the 4070, and more of power limit is what you're worried about. I'll let this benchmark play through once again for those who want to watch it, and mark the next part in the video where I move a little bit more of some MSI sliders and pull up some core clocks finally. Coming up at the end of the benchmark here, we can see that we only gained about 1 FPS average, but the minimum did come up, and we have the exact same maximum. Now hopping over to MSI Afterburner, I pulled the core clock up to 125 and memory to 1000. And in Myth Wukong, I left all the graphics settings the same and display settings are still the same. So let's see what kind of performance we get out of this. So off the start here, you can see we gain about 1 to 2 FPS, which is pretty good for pulling up some core clocks, but we're running into power limit at this point, it seems like, so after this I decided, fuck it, let's just pull all the sliders up and see if we can get some artifacting. I'll let the rest of this benchmark play through for those who want to see it, and mark the next part of the video where I pull up some sliders in the MSI Afterburner for those who want to skip ahead. So, if you want to watch it, enjoy. If not, I'll see you in the next part. So coming up here on the end of the benchmark, you can see we've gained about 2 FPS on average, and our maximum has rose 2 FPS as well, and minimum's 1 FPS. Low fifth is still the same, but a 2 FPS increase on average is pretty good and worth the overclock to me. So hopping back over to MSI Afterburner, I pulled the temp limit to its max, I added 1% core voltage, pulled the memory up a little bit more, and put our core clock at 165. So this should give us more FPS, and we might even see some fancy artifacting. I left all the display and graphic settings still the same. So right off the start here, you can see we gained another 1 to 2 FPS on average, and frame latency is still the same, with temps rising about 2 to 3 degrees sometimes, and fan speed still holding that 93% with my fan curve. We don't really see much artifacting until ray tracing gets turned on in the next benchmark, so I'll let the rest of this benchmark play through again for those who want to see it, and put another time mark for those who want to skip ahead where I turn on ray tracing with these overclock settings. So coming up here on the end of the benchmark, you can see we've gained 1 FPS on the average. Minimum has gone up by 1 to 2 FPS, maximum 1 FPS, and the 5th percentile is still about the same. I think it's 2 FPS lower. But overall, a pretty stable and good overclock. But going back to the main settings of Myth Wukong here, we changed the graphic settings by turning ray tracing to very high. Everything else is still the same. And I start this benchmark expecting it to go just as smooth as the last, but if you watch this one all the way through, you'll notice a few things left and right. So off the start of this benchmark, you can see we've gained about 4 to 5 FPS on average with the overclock and very high ray tracing settings. Initially on my first benchmark of this, I did see some visual artifacting with the ray tracing, but after going through the video 2 or 3 times, I cannot find where I saw the artifacting. So I don't know if it was just a monitor issue or I'm blind as hell. Could be either. If anybody else sees it, put a timestamp in it and let me know, but this is my first video using this editing software, so I also may have missed it in that aspect. But also, if anyone sees anything I missed in the editing software or would like to tell me how I did on this, I would very much appreciate it. But I'm going to let the rest of this benchmark play through and I'll be back at the results. So coming up here on the benchmark results, you can see we've gained that 5 FPS average with rises to our mins and maxes. Lows are also higher, and we used about 7.5 gigs of VRAM. But if anyone stuck around this long to the video, thank you for that. And if anybody's got any optimization ideas for the build that involve anything but flipping the radiator, I would love to hear it. And thank you for watching. And yes, I know the GPU with a fan bread tied to the front of it looks a little wild, but don't pay attention, the back one's bread tied in too.